Hi, folks. It's me again. So I'm going to continue going on with the live journey of living with borderline personality disorder. I wanted to get into some toxic trait stuff today. Oftentimes, when we go online, we hear this regurgitated crap that borderlines are associated with narcissists. We see it in the cluster B sort of diagnoses. And I actually wanted to get into the topic about narcissism today, um, and the relation with borderline personality disorder. I've been doing this journal called The Live Journey through Borderline Personality Disorder. Each video is kind of on different themes. Last video, we did a theme on the attraction to addictions, why certain people may be attracted. And I got into vitamin deficiencies and supplements, some of the things that worked for me, and communicating how if you do have a disorder, the likelihood of you having a physical deficiency or having physical symptoms are there, and you need to kind of get in tune with that as well, if you really want to start tackling your health. Though, today I'm going to get into narcissistic traits. This is such an interesting topic because unfortunately, this is probably one of the few things that pisses me off the most when I listen about borderline personality disorder. You hear that these borderlines are these narcissistic people, they're so terrible, and blah, 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 blah. And I have a problem with that because the reality is that if you're a narcissist, the likelihood of you seeking help, the likelihood of you actually getting help for yourself is zero. Narcissists don't admit that there's anything wrong with them. Nothing. And the reality is that if you're borderline, you likely have empathy. And this is the thing that's really not being advertised too much. And it sometimes really bothers me because I think that with borderline, it's more of a trained response versus a narcissist who is inherently responding that way. Um, Both are a result of abuse, um, but a narcissist is more inherently unable to see what they do wrong. They are so full of themselves. They don't they're so grandiose, or they're so covert that the likelihood of them seeking help is none. But for borderlines, that is quite the opposite. We are the most likely to seek help, most likely to go seek therapy. And that is because we carry empathy. And anybody who says that we're not treatable or we're narcissistic really needs to evaluate themselves a little bit. Only because I do believe that the narcissistic traits of borderline are trained if they are there. And if they are there, then that means that they can be untrained. Um, so let me explain this to you. They can be untrained if they're in a borderline because a borderline has empathy and we are able to account for it. Whereas with a narcissist, they don't have empathy. So it's very hard to treat a narcissist. You could spend years trying to treat a narcissist and they might be so full of themselves that they still do not apply the things that they need to apply. Here's my theory. I believe that most people who are borderline personality disorder actually grew up around a parent figure that was abusive, um, and likely dealt with a narcissist in their lives. I mean, all these people online, they go on and on about narcissistic survivor abuse and oh, poor me. And meanwhile, they'll just go, look at these borderlines. These borderlines are causing me to be this way. And at one point, I'm like, I want to feel empathy for you. I agree, this is a terrible thing. But at the same point, you are literally screaming at the borderline or saying, oh, you're doing all these bad things. And we go online and we read all these negative things that borderlines are doing. Meanwhile, the likelihood of that borderline being a survivor of narcissistic abuse is very high. And I mean that. I mean that when a borderline was growing up and having these core personality traits disrupted, they were probably around a parental figure who had narcissistic traits. Those narcissistic traits, when they're unidentified, are really toxic. And when they're unidentified, they can go into really affecting children, particularly children, and our prime developmental years. I mean, we can go off and off and off about how bad these borderlines are, but we don't really want to get into the fact that the likelihood of these borderlines being victims to narcissistic abuse as a young kid. And are they really at fault for that? And that's the next question I gotta ask everyone on the table. Are they really at fault on that? I mean, you all want empathy for the fact that you're a survivor of narcissistic abuse. But at the same time, you're not giving the same form of empathy to these borderlines that actually probably experienced narcissistic abuse as a child and have formed these narcissistic traits as almost protection mechanisms. And what I mean by that, protection mechanisms. Well, let me get into protection mechanisms with narcissism, okay? I'll give you an example. My mother used to gaslight me all the time. I theorized that she had the same diagnosis as me, but she was undiagnosed. And that she hasn't done the effort on her diagnosis the same. But she had narcissistic tendencies in her diagnosis, probably from her mother upbringing and etc. and whatever. But when I'm saying is that, for example, my mother used to gaslight me all the time and say, oh, that never happened. And, like when my stepdad, he physically attacked me, she was just like, oh, that never happened. And when I was sexually assaulted, she was like in complete denial, being like, this never happened. These are all your delusions. All your delusions. And I used to get enraged and upset and all these sorts of emotions from this. And this is how they say, so I guess my emotional dysregulation from being gaslit all the time, was really happening. And what I find interesting about this is one thing. Okay, throughout my whole life, my mother played these stunts. My mother played these games where she would do the most terrible things to me and then expect me to kind of just welcome her back into my life. Right? And the thing is with borderlines, unfortunately, we have very, very poor boundaries. And until it's taught on how to have boundaries, we will just accept all these traumatic bonds into our fields, we have less self-worth because we've been convinced that we are worth that much. And we have identity issues. And when all of that is occurring at once, you can quickly see what's going to happen. If you haven't watched the other videos that I've gone through like a different, like, you know, concepts on borderline personality disorder. This is sort of like my journal log. Today, I really wanted to do narcissistic tendencies. I actually believe that narcissism is everywhere. I actually believe it is everywhere. I think everybody has a bit of narcissism in them. What do I mean by that? Well, I actually believe that we're in a pretty capitalistic individualism society. When you go on our media, when you look at what's embedded in our current society and what we promote through our ads and etc., there is a narcissism sort of undertow, sort of layer that exists in this sorts of programming that's going on. And it's not an inherent narcissist. Now, an inherent narcissist is someone who is more involved and basically cannot even identify themselves that they're narcissistic. That makes any sense. They don't think there's anything wrong with them, needless to say. But I'll get into this. What I mean by this is there's a difference between like inherent narcissists versus like narcissists who are taught to be narcissistic. Now, with borderline, these traits that I'm discussing about have been taught. They have been fucking taught. And here's what I mean by this. Is my mother used to gaslight me all the time. All the time. She was a classic narcissistic individual. Do I think that she was a narcissist by definition? I don't think that she was a narcissist by definition. I actually think she had the same disorder as me. I just think that she had narcissistic traits in her disorder. And yes, the things that she was doing to me were very, very wrong. But I don't think she's inherently a narcissist. I think she is either got the same disorder as me, or she might be in a different disorder, like antisocial or something different going on there. I don't think she's just a narcissist, which is funny. But does she have narcissistic traits? Damn freaking right. I had to learn to deal with a narcissist. And for years, I would let this person back into my life. I would let her come back in my life, and then she would set me up and basically destroy it again. She would set me up and say I'm delusional while she was doing really messed up things to me. I am a survivor of narcissistic abuse. I am a literal fucking survivor of it. And it's funny because here I am online listening to all this crap saying these borderlines are these narcissists, da 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 da, and I'm just like, okay, are we going to talk about the fact that most borderlines are actually survivors of narcissistic abuse? Because it's likely that that is there. And here we go. I had to learn how to be more cold to my mother. And here we go in saying this stuff. I had so much empathy for my mother then I would welcome her back in. I would forgive her. I would let her do what she did over and over and over again. And then I learned that the only way to deal with her was to be cold, was to be less responsive, was to not give her as much empathy. Because I learned that every time that I gave her empathy, I would get hurt. And so it was as though I learned how to be more cold, how to have less empathy to deal with a narcissist. And so I was mirroring her sort of responses. I was mirroring her inability to have empathy. And so I would shut down with her. And I would not let her in. And she used to get so upset at me. She used to be like, get so angry all of a sudden. Now all of a sudden she doesn't like that I'm doing it back to her. That I'm not letting her back in. I'm not giving her the empathy that she wants. Why? Because her narcissism preyed on my empathy. I learned that I had to show her less empathy in order to survive. And I believe that most borderlines are narcissistic abuse survivors. That's my actual belief on this. As a result, you have learnt narcissism traits. Why? Because you were around a narcissist probably in your core developmental years, or around narcissistic tendencies in your core developmental years. And what I mean by that is that narcissistic tendencies are the things that are learned. I learned my narcissistic tendencies from my mother. And I learned that when I dealt with narcissism, I was more narcissistic. I would mirror their inability to have empathy and shut down around them. And I say this out loud because I think it was a protection mechanism, really. And I find it fascinating that I go online and I just always keep on seeing all this crap saying like, oh, borderlines are narcissists. I'm like, what? I don't think borderlines are narcissists. I think that we have narcissistic tendencies that are like basically a protection mechanism that has been taught from being around narcissists growing up. Probably a narcissistic like survivor. Narcissist abuse survivor, which if you go online, you hear all these like, honest traits. Like if you've survived a narcissistic abuse, like poor you, and I feel for you. And there's this huge like, online freaking support system going on. And you read all these, positive comments and everybody's backing each other up and blah, blah, blah. But then when you read like a feed on borderline personality disorders, they just rip them apart, blah, blah, blah. But meanwhile, they don't want to discuss the fact that most borderlines are narcissistic abuse survivors. They don't want to discuss that. No, they don't. And that bugs me. So narcissistic tendencies. Let's get into it. Yeah. So some of the things that I was just getting into was how we can mirror the narcissist. And what I mean by that, I'm just going to say it, is that some borderlines have a protection mechanism against narcissists. And they've learned that to deal with the narcissist is to be a little bit more narcissistic. To not give the narcissist empathy. To not give the narcissist the things that they want, per se. Because a narcissist is very manipulative on getting what they want. They always get what they want, no matter what. They don't care who they walked over in order to get there. They do not care. And they will walk all over you. And the thing is with borderline is usually when you have self-worth issues, you just let these people walk over you over and over and over again. And you internalize it. You think it's your fault. You think that, oh, this is my problem. Maybe they're right. Maybe start questioning your memory. All these sorts of things. But then you don't realize is that you're actually a victim of narcissistic abuse. This is quite common. And you've developed traits from the narcissist, from being around that person for so fucking long. And I mean that. You've learned that you can't be as empathetic when you're dealing with that sort of behavior. You've learned that you can't let this person walk all over you again. Even though you love them and care about them. And they're so manipulative. They're so manipulative to make sure that they know that you mustn't love them. You mustn't care for them. You mustn't blah, 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 whatever the crap that they fucking told you. It's not true. You decided to stand up for yourself. And the minute you decided to stand up for yourself, you gave them less empathy than before. You decided to cut them out. And when you did, they started love bombing you. They started giving you all this attention. They started, really prying at you. And you may have fell for it all over again. You may have given them empathy again. You may have let them back in, blah, 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 just to get hurt all over again. Anyways. Narcissistic tendencies are taught. They're freaking taught with borderlines mostly. I do not think that borderlines are inherently narcissistic. I think that we have generally two personalities that we're combating at once. Most of this is from protection mechanisms, from abuse, and most of this is because we are survivors from narcissistic abuse itself. And because of that, we have narcissistic tendencies because we are around freaking narcissists. And also, we're more likely to be attracted to more narcissists later in our future. That means that we're more likely to go into a future relationship with a narcissist all over again. Because we had a trauma bond or some form of deep bond that was like a parental figure in our life that was a narcissist in our life. It's like we're repeating or remirroring our childhood all over again into our future lives. And yes, so we may actually have all these unstable relationships. And people say, oh, like borderlines have all these unstable relationships. I'm like, yeah, but borderlines have a tendency to pick unstable people at first. And I mean that because borderlines generally don't have fucking boundaries. We have no boundaries until they're taught properly. And we have self-worth issues and identity issues. And until those things are resolved, we are welcoming in people of that worth and of that self-worth and those identity issues. So we are attracting those types of unstable people, whether that be other people with mental health issues, narcissistic tendencies, etc., etc. The list goes on. We are re-traumatizing ourselves through re-trauma bonding. Now, this is a different circumstance when we're getting into a person that is a healthy person that we may be coming into contact with. But generally speaking, most borderlines are with people who are unstable to begin with. when they're untreated. And I mean that. Healthy people tend to just leave the situation if they're untreated pretty relatively quickly. Some might attempt to keep going, but I mean, if you're healthy enough, then maybe you need to see that your partner and you need to go to a therapist and get evaluated and see what's going on. And talk about your emotions and talk about your feelings and the dynamics of your relationship. But the reality is most borderlines are attracting themselves to unstable relationships because they don't have fucking boundaries. And I mean that because when I first started getting into relationships, I had zero boundaries. Zero. And I was allowing all these really abusive relationships into my life. And I mean abusive relationships. And people say, oh, borderlines are so terrible. But I'm like, yeah, but if you really want me to go backlog into, my history, it's not the best history. I was constantly attracted to other men that had substance abuse problems, that were narcissistic, that were that were full of themselves, like so full of themselves. I had partners who were really, really toxic, and that was because they had no boundaries either on some levels. And when I mean no boundaries, I mean I was getting abused. I was getting punched in the face, and I was getting hit, and I would stay in abusive relationships. Literally stay in abusive relationships. I would let men cheat on me with multiple women. I would there's so many things on that list that I could say of what I was allowing other people to do to me. Was because I had no self-confidence and no self-worth. And so what I say for borderlines is if you find out that you have borderline personality disorder, and this is why I say you get this diagnosis, it is an amazing thing to get your diagnosis if you haven't gotten it yet. And the reason why I say that is because now you know exactly what's going on. And you're able to see a professional on rehabilitating those things. One of the major things that you're going to end up rehabilitating on is rewiring your thought processes and rewiring your boundary processes. And I mean that. That's one of the biggest things that you start getting into right away is how what you want in your life. What are you willing to accept in your life? And the thing is with borderlines is you're just so open to accept anything when you have no boundaries. And the reality is that, you gotta have boundaries. You gotta have boundaries. Or you're just gonna keep going into unstable relationship after unstable relationship. And it's only gonna last short while. I had a lot of relationships that were only like 6 months long, 3 months, 6 months, a year. I mean, there was a year relationship that should have been done at 6 months or 3 months, but I just kept dragging it out, even though the guy was hitting me, even though it was so toxic that I shouldn't have been there. I just kept going because I had no boundaries. Now, when I talk about narcissistic traits, I say that these traits are learned if you are a borderline. And when I say that it's learned, I mean that that's quite capable to be unlearned. It means that you got to go see a therapist, and you might need to go and discuss kind of like memory jog with your therapist about some of the first memories of what may have caused your borderline, some of the things that may have been not right as a kid or whatever. But through those memory jogs, you might start to remember a particular narcissist in your life. And that particular narcissist in your life, why did you start, may have learned some narcissist traits from this narcissist? I learned that by exhibiting narcissist traits to this narcissist, I was able to actually get this person away from me. It was a protection mechanism. Here's the thing, is that when I'm around narcissists, I was going through almost a protection response where when I was dealing with narcissistic traits, I would start to mirror and be a narcissist back to protect myself, because I didn't want to show empathy to the narcissist because I saw it as a vulnerability, only because of my past events where if I had shown vulnerability to the narcissist, they took advantage of me or really hurt me. As a result, I was getting these narcissistic tendencies almost as a protection mechanism to protect myself from the narcissistic tendencies that I was dealing with. So, there you go. That's what I'm going to say on that one. And I'm going to keep talking about it. Okay, what kind of traits was I doing that I can talk about, that I know that I need to discuss, just in general? So, narcissistic traits are very, very self-absorbed. Yeah, there's so many different types of narcissists. They say that the covert narcissist. I say covert narcissist. Those are dangerous times too, because they kind of infiltrate your mind in the way that they infiltrate your mind. But just remember that BPD are usually the most likely to go seek treatment. The reason for is because we do have empathy. I thoroughly do not agree that we're intrinsically narcissistic. I think that is a trained tendency. If you have it, and you are likely a narcissistic abuse survivor, to say that you're not, well, I just don't see it. Because borderlines usually form from people who borderlines are usually formed through that sort of abuse, or some form of major abuse, and they had to pretend it didn't happen to them at some point. Trust me, I'm going to tell you that. They were gaslit into pretending that this thing didn't happen to them when it did. Whatever that thing is, whether that be sexual assault, whether that be physical abuse, there are things that were happening to them as a kid, and they were pretty much gaslit into this sort of environment, acting like it never happened to them. So that is why I think that we develop narcissistic tendencies to deal with the narcissist. And I think that there's actually an article about how people can become more narcissistic dealing with like borderlines. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So you're telling me that you have a defense mechanism that's very narcissistic against narcissistic tendencies, but I'm pretty sure these narcissistic tendencies were developed from a defense mechanism dealing with narcissism. Is lovely wheel that's going on here, right? So let me get into it. Here's what can seem narcissistic about a borderline, and I'm just going to say it because we've all heard of the favorite person. Have we all heard of the favorite person with borderline yet? Basically, we adopt a favorite person. And we trust this person to talk about all of our problems and like get super close. And this might be like someone we've adopted as our friend, even our favorite person, someone that we love and care about. And when our favorite person doesn't give us attention, oh, that is a heartbreaking moment. Unfortunately, it's just unrealistic. Very, very unrealistic. I actually think that borderlines can develop narcissistic tendencies in the way that we entitle our energy or entitle our thoughts onto others. And what I mean by that is if you have a favorite person with borderline, you probably are doing narcissistic tendencies to that favorite person, whether you like it or not. And unless you're aware of what I'm talking about, you could be losing friends, or you could be losing close connections to people, just in general, that you have adopted as your favorite person. And you're going to keep on having this problem where your favorite person is just going to end up gone after a year or two. And this is when I realized I had narcissistic tendencies. And this is not to say that I recognize that I had some narcissistic tendencies in some of the arguments that I was going through with some of the men that I was dealing with. But at the same time, I also recognized that I was borderline and I was attracting some really messed up men in my life. I was attracting real narcissists in my life. I was dealing with real narcissists. The only problem with me was this favorite person thing. And I really need to talk about this because I think I would have been more well off just in general if I knew about it earlier. And so I would talk to my favorite person or put them in between me and my partner, or basically pour all of my like leverage or all of my problems onto my favorite person all the time. And I was almost creating this emotional responsibility to them. And the part that was narcissistic was me being entitled to think that they can handle it. And that's not fair, and it's not right. Going back, I realized that I used to write novels of thoughts and these impulsivities, and I would send them to these favorite people that I had adopted into my life. And I was causing emotional stress. I was causing emotional dysregulation in their lives through this sort of like relation that was going on. And it was really, really unhealthy. It was unhealthy. I lost a lot of my close friends growing up because I adopted these favorite people that I would dump all this emotional baggage. Now, when I went to therapy for borderline and I went to dialect behavioral therapy, one of the first things I was like, I need to work on my verbal spewing. Right now, I need to work on how many times I am typing these messages. What am I saying in these messages? And what am I sending to the people that I'm around, whether that be the relation that I'm into to the favorite person that's involved, right? And I can say now, since I've been working on it, I can say now that this is a thing. Verbal spewing is a common thing with borderline, with impulsivity, where we are likely to have a moment where we verbal spew all this stuff, and it's not necessarily stuff that we're gonna want to say in several hours from now. And so one of the biggest things that I had to learn with my therapist was get a therapist, because the reality is that your favorite person is not medically qualified. And there should be no reason why your best friend or your favorite person is actually responsible for all of your emotional baggage. That's a very narcissistic thing, unfortunately. A very narcissistic thing to have expectations to that other person to be taking all your emotional load. And the reality is that they're probably not qualified. And then for privacy reasons, it's probably best to do it with a therapist, because no one else is going to go around and start gossiping about you and blah, 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 blah. In my situation, I feel pretty comfortable being transparent and talking about things, because I've spent so many years now reflecting and treating on this that I feel like I could give some, positive words on why I want to discuss this with people, just in general. But the reason that I feel drawn to be so transparent is that I hope that I can give some advice and some insights on where I'm coming from when I'm seeing the feeds that I see, when I see the progress that we've made in the research that I see, and some of the insights and thoughts that I've had along my way for the many of years that I've been at this, because I've been actually actively at this in my head since I was 25 years old, so 8 years actively. 8 years actively at this in my head. Trying to deal with what's going on. And, that's a pretty decent chunk of time to be spending on reflecting into my memory logs, into everything that's occurred in my life, to be able to discuss the levels of things that I see and the things that I want to share with the world, just in general. And I don't even care if this video ever makes it out to more than a dozen people. I'm just going to say what I gotta say. I'm going to put it out there, because I think it's important that we have more people who have the diagnosis to actually be talking out loud, because it will give us more of an understanding about the fact that, we are human. We are real people. We do not need to be desensitized. We do not need to be dehumanized. And there are often times that I constantly see online of all these sorts of feeds and the responses, very dehumanizing responses about borderline. And to me, that's just got to change. Just in general. It's got to change. Yep. Anyways. Let's keep going. So, verbal spewing. And I want to get into this because it was bad. It was bad. My impulsivity was so bad. And this is where I know I was so narcissistic to fucking think that they could take that. And I look back at it now and go, oh my God, you did that to them? Like, why would you do such a thing, right? But my impulsivities were just so surreal that I was so hurt that I thought that they needed to know what I was going through. And that's, really not the case. They didn't need to know everything that was going on with me. So I would verbal spew these messages, and I mean novels. Like, sometimes I had 12 long messages. Sometimes I was messaging 20 messages in an hour, and they were overwhelmed by all of this crap that they're getting in. And yeah, that's a narcissistic trait, honey. It's a narcissistic trait. Impulsivity with verbal spewing. Yeah, and just expecting someone else to take on that verbal spewing. That's an impulsivity trait, and it's very narcissistic. The only way that you could actually deal with that is to start to manage it. I know for me, what I had to do so that I could stop doing that to my favorite people was I would write something and then I would give it a break. Just write whatever the fuck you want to write. You have this long message and kind of just put it like on hold, and then you come back when you've calmed down, like after a few hours or whatever, and then you read what you were gonna send. And the reality is you realize that, holy crap, I shouldn't send that. Are you kidding me? Why would I send this? And so it just takes a little time. And what I mean is that when you're in the impulsivity reaction, that can come off as narcissistic. And because the borderline have this impulsivity reaction, sometimes it's so explosive and so extreme at first that we don't realize how we're affecting other people around us. And because we don't realize how we're affecting other people around us, that comes off as narcissistic. Because we're so self-absorbed in our impulsivity. So when you do therapy, with dialect behavioral therapy or whatever therapy that you decide to take on, you're gonna manage that impulsivity. When you manage that impulsivity, you will find that those narcissistic traits are gonna start going down. For example, one of the major things that I do now in my impulsivity is I don't just send that message. I wait till the next morning. If it's so freaking important, then it can wait a day or wait a few hours before I just send the message. Take a nice long walk, have a bath, calm down, do something complete opposite from the stimulation that I'm focused on, and then return to the stimulation instead of reacting to the automatic impulsivity reaction that can come off as narcissistic. Now I am taking control of that impulsivity reaction and getting a better management of that reaction. That makes sense. So for me, now I even count how many text messages I send when I know I'm being impulsive. When I know I'm in an impulsive reaction, I calm down, I step back, I even start counting how many text messages I've sent in the day to really consider the thoughts that I'm saying, etc. So I'm not being too much onto somebody else. I lost a few friends in the process between ages 22 to ages 30, even, through those impulsivity responses of just being very impulsive and expecting other people to take on that energy. So that's a narcissistic trait. That is a narcissistic trait. And I think that the narcissism is that you don't think about what others are feeling, are experiencing at that time when you're being impulsively releasing. And when you're impulsively releasing, it's like your brain is like on automatic drive. It's almost primal. It's almost natural to be impulsively reacting, but it's not healthy. It's something that you're going to have to rewire and relearn. That's why I say that borderline narcissistic traits are actually trained responses. I don't believe that they're intrinsically narcissistic. And I do believe that it can be unrewired. With borderline, it's all about the rewiring process. It's all about the rewiring process. It's a whole process. And what I mean by that is that, for example, in my quiet BBD, like when I was like disassociated, like I would spend long periods of time like in my own thoughts, self-sabotage in my own thoughts. I had to rewire that. And what I mean by that is I was drilling in my head on a constant basis that I wanted to kill myself, that I was ugly, that no one likes me, that I had all these self-worth sort of things. And if you look into my history, in my first video, I really got deep with viewers to kind of discuss on some of the trauma that I experienced when I was growing up, as to why those quiet forms started to form. And in my first video, it was getting into some of the depths and some of the rawness of sexual assault, sexual abuse, all that sort of stuff, and bullying, and not having a validating family that you grow up around, like a role model that can give you those healthy personality traits, or those healthy traits that make you feel good about yourself, like self-worth. You didn't find something that you were creating a healthy bond with. And I think like in Inside Out, like that movie, they have like the different islands, and I think it's important for every single human being to have, that family island, the family island, the friend islands, and then they had like the hobby, like her hockey island or whatever, and that's your hobbies, And I think with the personality, like Inside Out, it kind of talks about those personality islands, and I think it's so true because for borderlines, like we tend to have those islands damaged. Maybe we're not having a good relation with the family island. Maybe we have a broken down sort of relation now happening with Friendship Island. Maybe we're now, kind of falling apart when it comes to our hobbies or our passions or the things that make us who we are and what we love to do. And that just requires reintegration, and that requires relearning some major things. So if you're doing something like what I'm saying, I think if you're borderline and you have adopted a favorite person, I need you to step back, go see a therapist and talk about it, because I'm telling you that favorite person is not going to last for super long. It's not going to last super long. You're going to overwhelm that favorite person. Just bite it in the ass now. Start to address it, and see if you can start to manage how you communicate with those impulsivities. Woo-hoo. So, another thing that could come off as narcissistic is through those impulsivities, you can exhibit different traits. For example, rage. You could be very rageful. You're screaming, you're yelling, you're very absorbed in your own feelings. And again, that's going to take some time to actually manage. It's not an overnight process. It's not something that you just deal with in one night. It's impossible. It's going to require real work. It's going to require you to start challenging those impulsivities and to manage them in a way that you can be more in control of yourself and in your emotions, and start to regulate them. The other thing that can come off as narcissistic with the BPD is that when they're in a relationship with someone that's healthy, and you're untreated, and you're letting out these impulsivities to someone that's healthy, these impulsivities can be very self-absorbed, and it can come off as narcissistic. It's just the reality. Now, if you're treating yourself before you get into any relationship, you need to really discuss with your partner what your diagnosis is. You really need to be aware of discussing with your partner that if there are things that are arising in your relationship where your partner is starting to experience these impulsivities, that you and your partner maybe seek some couple therapy, or something that can give you what you need for each other. And what I mean by that is that someone who's borderline may be more emotionally sensitive to criticism, maybe emotionally sensitive to certain things that maybe a normal relationship you wouldn't be as sensitive to. And so generally that healthy person that had healthy attachments growing up, they don't see these things. They don't understand. And so they're gonna also have to be taught a emotional toolbox on how to communicate with their partner a little bit while their partner is going through treatment, or while their partner is going through that too. If you really do want to be in a relationship with someone who is borderline, who is being in treatment, now she's severe, that's the reality that you should really be signing up for almost immediately, because that's the reality that you're dealing with, and it's going to take some time for that person to get through the management of those impulsivities that we have. I hope my little rant on today was insightful, a little bit insightful, because I wanted to get into it a bit today about impulsivities and why that can come up as narcissistic. And I wanted to say, why we can come off as a little bit even cold at times.